Welcome to Parenting Different, a place where real adoption stories come to life. My name is Anna Bernacki, and this is the Parenting Different podcast. Welcome to the Parenting Different podcast. We have April with us today. She is with Flourishing Families of South Carolina. I am so excited to have you with us. You are just a wealth of information. You've done a few workshops for us over on Thrive with Parenting Different, and they have been so unbelievably incredible. I've sat there taking notes, absorbing it all. I absolutely love listening to you. I think you just present the information. Some of it's information that I've heard before, but the way you present it is so unique and so easily applicable to our lives. And I just really appreciate you being here today and being willing to share more of your knowledge with us today. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm April Ficklin. I live here in South Carolina. I was born and raised here. I am currently the Director of Family Support Services for the Flourishing Families of South Carolina. We are a nonprofit with a partnership with our local Department of Social Services, and we provide pre- and post-adoptive services to families here. So I'm sure we'll get to a point where I'll talk a little bit about how I got here, because it was definitely not where I anticipated I would be. But I'm also a mama. I'm a mama of 4 teenagers. I have just launched my first adult child, which is surreal and sad and all the things. And so she is 18 at the College of Charleston. And then I have a 16-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 14-year-old. So a house full of teens.
Yes.
And my family adopted through South Carolina DSS about 9.5 years ago. So our youngest two are biologically brother and sister, and they were able to stay together and come live in our home. So
That's amazing. So when you started the adoption journey, some people are like, I've always wanted to adopt. Some people it landed in their lap. That's more my story. I didn't want to, and it happened. So tell us a little bit about the beginning stages. How did that process start for you in beginning? Because you adopted through foster care. So
yeah.
how did that process all begin?
Sure. So actually, it started a long time ago when I was a teenager. I started with, I always have this visual image that goes with me about our journey of a tire swing. So it's kind of become a symbol for me of this calling that God gave me individually and then my family. So when I was 15, I traveled to Rhode Island on a mission trip with a local church. And just during that experience of just seeing need and really engaging with children and kind of just falling in love with that aspect, I just had this feeling of this calling from God as I'm swinging 3 children in a tire swing, as a teenage girl, that one day he would want me to adopt. And so honestly, looking back, it's very much what is sometimes that typical fairy tale illusion of what adoption is and what our role is in wanting to adopt. And so I just kind of knew it was a tugging at my heart, and it was consistent through years and years of, finishing high school, going into college. When my husband and I started dating, it was a topic of conversation. He knew that this was something that was very likely going to happen in our future because it had been something really important to me for many years. At that point, still though, we were very naive, didn't really know anyone much in the adoption or even foster care world, but knew that this was a need that we wanted to fill. So we got married in our mid-20s, and by our late 20s began to have a family. And so my daughter was born, and then my son, and things were going pretty well. We thought we were pretty stinking good parents, to be quite honest with you. They got to be school age. I decided I was a high school English teacher. And that's what I had since I was 5. I just knew I was going to be a teacher. That's always what I wanted to be. I never wanted to be anything else. And so I went into education. I was a high school English teacher. Then I had my first child and decided I didn't really want to leave her, in daycare or with someone else. I really wanted to have that time with her. And so I spent many years doing adjunct teaching and teaching virtually and whatever I could to be able to stay home as much as possible with the kids. And so by the time they got to elementary school age, we began to talk through adoption again. We had the opportunities to say yes to a unique experience when the kids were young in a summer program where Ukrainian orphans visit the United States for 5 weeks over the
Oh,
summer.
wow.
And so we had a 15-year-old, Lena, who came with and stayed with us for 5 weeks. She was incredible, beautiful, sweet, sweet, but she didn't speak any English. She only spoke
Oh,
Russian.
my.
So it
I'll
was
throw Russian
quite an experience. Yes, she was 15, and my kids were like 3 and 5. And so it was both beautiful and really, really challenging at the same time. And we recognized that her age was not what we felt was going to be best for our family at the time. And so we didn't pursue adoption there, but it did begin to open our eyes more to what the needs were and really what our family's capacity was to be able to say yes, and kind of begin to be an experience that aligned our hearts for the same path. And so a few years later, we began to look into taking the steps for adopting through the Department of Social Services. And so we began that process. It was, like a lot of people experience, long, tedious, frustrating. We kept hearing the need, children living or sleeping in, county offices and the number of children needing adopting. However, the process was taking a really long time. So it was frustrating.
Yeah.
But my older two, they were in elementary school at this time. And we decided we would open our home to up to 2 children, thinking that since there was a really strong bond between my daughter and son, that just taking in one child might be kind of hard for them. They
Mhm.
might feel like, kind of out of that bonding experience. So we opened up to being able to take 2 children. And if you know anything about, if you open your home to that, that's what's going to happen, right?
Yep, we're gonna
And
fill it up
so,
real fast.
yes. So after we got licensed, after our license came through, I had just recently connected with a childhood friend who was working at a local children's home. And she actually knew that DSS was going to match us with a sweet and precious brother and sister that she already knew in that home before
Oh,
we even knew. So she knew of the match. She couldn't tell me, but she was really excited for that. So at that point, we're all very optimistic and excited and feel called to this, and just still living in very much a fairy tale of what it's going to be like to grow our family this way. And so our children moved in on Good Friday of 2016.
wow.
Um, and they are and were adorable. They're beautiful and precious. They moved in on a Friday. On Saturday morning, I woke up and immediately thought, what in the world have we done? Because there was chaos in the living room from moment one. So it did not take long to realize things were going to be a lot harder than I think we thought that they were going to be. Um, so that's kind of where we started and how we got to that point of actually adopting and then moving in.
So then they come, you're realizing you are way out of your league very quickly. Same experience with us. We were like, wait, we said go to your room and you said no. Like that wasn't how, wait, there's a hole in the wall. That nobody told us we were going to have this
Yeah.
in week 1. So it was, yeah, it's a rude awakening right away. For us, there wasn't even a honeymoon period. It was right off
Yep.
the bat. And we definitely, actually, my husband told me, he said, you need to put in our 14-day notice. And I just knew deep down. So I forgot to call the caseworker. And then the next day I forgot. And I forgot a few days. And then he came around, but conveniently forgot. Because I just knew deep down, like we had to stick it out. I
Right.
just knew. It's so much different than what you expect. No matter what training, well, I shouldn't say no matter what training. The training we took certainly didn't prepare us for any of that, which I
Absolutely.
get. They don't want to scare you away from doing it, but also a little touch of reality would have been very helpful and very beneficial, preparing us for literally anything instead of nothing. um,
Mhm.
so it was wild. We had parented no kids. So we didn't have any kids, and this is not at all what we expected.
Yep.
So at what point did you kind of say, okay, we need to rethink all of this parenting stuff if we're going to make this work? And then even with your older biological kids, I think that adds another component of it too. How did you navigate your relationships with them, figuring out how to build that safe attachment with the younger ones? How did you navigate blending it all together?
Yeah. Um, so it was really interesting because I really think we had come to a point where it was really the easiest parenting season we had had with our biological children right up to, you know, expanding our family. And so my biological children were thriving. They were doing really well in school, to the point where actually it's really neat. My adopted son was in kindergarten at my children's school before we knew him, before we were
Mm,
matched with him. And so he was already there and his teachers knew him, but he was really struggling, to be able to handle a classroom setting. He was in kindergarten and a lot was going on in his life. And so he was just really having some challenging behaviors. And so we had people warning us that, hey, you've got some of the best kids in the school already. Do you really know what you're doing by, you know, adding this to the mix? Um, and so that was really discouraging, to be honest,
yeah,
in the beginning, not very helpful, but began to kind of show us that things maybe were going to be harder than what we had anticipated. But we were going along so well that I think there was a bit of arrogance that we had in our parenting
yeah,
that lasted a little longer than I would like to admit. And so things got hard, but we kept using the same tools that we had in our toolbox because that's what we had and that's what had
right.
worked. And so in our minds, like we had seen it work. We knew that it worked. And so of course we expected that if we just dug our heels in, if we just put in the effort, we were consistent, we would see the same results with those tools. And weeks went by and months went by. And quite honestly, years went by where we felt like we were just hitting our head against the wall because nothing we were doing that came from our traditional toolbox was changing behavior,
Yeah,
was creating connection, um, none of those things. So it wasn't all terrible, but we were definitely sitting in a place where we're like, we are over our heads. We don't know what we're doing. And I cried myself to sleep many, many nights, prayed
mhm,
hard for some supernatural parenting to wake up the next morning and just feel like I'd messed it up again. Like I knew there was something that needed to change, but I didn't know what that was. Um, so we began to look for some tools and, we joined about a year after the adoption, we joined a small group of foster and adoptive parents. And that was really the first community that we had in this world. And it was life giving, in a way that I never would have anticipated. So we sat in a circle. It was supposed to be a small group. I think there were supposed to be Bible study and those kind of things happening. But really, what it ended up being was like we sat in a circle and we shared all the crazy things that were happening in our homes. And as I began to share what was going on, in my house, that, these frustrations I was having, these behaviors we were seeing, how things weren't changing, all these moms and dads started nodding their heads.
Mm.
And it was the first time where I was like, oh, wait a minute. Hold on. This is happening in your house too? And they were all like, absolutely. Because my experience up until that point with my friends who were just parenting biological children is I would share about what I was learning about trauma. I'd share about what was going on with my children, and they would misinterpret. They would not understand. There was just a lack of understanding, even in their eyes, when we would go for teacher meetings and try to say, okay, I understand this is challenging, but this is what we think is happening. There was just a lack of understanding. And so to be in a room where people were just organically, naturally nodding their heads because they were living what we were living was extremely life-giving for me. And so we eventually were introduced to The Connected Child, which is the book written by Karen Purvis, who eventually created trust-based relational intervention, which is going to become, as I talk to you about my story, a big part of it. But I read The Connected Child, and I learned a lot about trauma. I learned a lot about fear,
Mm-hmm.
but I was still really skeptical, to be quite honest.
Same.
Um,
I read that. I was like,
yeah.
Okay,
Yep, exactly.
makes
I was like,
sense, but yes.
a little soft. This seems a little permissive. I don't know.
Yes.
Does not fit into the paradigm that I'm used to with parenting. And
Yeah.
so it took small exposures over and over and over and over again for a long period of time for me to be able to really embrace a mindset shift in parenting and to start to incorporate that into our home. But once we did, we began to see big changes happening over time. They weren't quick, they weren't overnight, but when we were steadfast in those strategies and in changing our mindset and changing our expectations and those kinds of things, we were able to see some of the things that we wanted, some of the outcomes. And one of the biggest things that I really wish you talked about the training, right? Like the training did not prepare us for this. And I don't think there's any training that's ever going to help us understand the full reality of what
Right.
living this is. However, what I always say, I wish I knew, is that fear doesn't look like what I thought fear was going to look like for my children. So I knew my kids were going to be fearful, right? That makes common sense. Like they're coming from a difficult situation. They're moving from a place that they've been for a year and a half that has become comfortable enough into strangers' homes. Like, of course, they're going to be fearful. But I thought fearful was going to look different. I thought it was going to need cuddling. I thought it was going to need reassurance. I thought that's what fear was going to look like. But it's not. Fear looked like temper tantrums in the corner, and it looked like lying, and it looked like poop smeared on my wall, and like these bizarre and strange behaviors that began popping up that just felt like chaos and stress in the moment and never registered on my own intuitively that this was communication of fear that was happening. And so when I was able to start to understand that the behaviors were coming out of a lack of trust that my children had, because of course they have a lack of trust from
Right.
their life
Had
experiences.
no reason to trust.
Right.
Yeah.
Then I could shift my strategies a lot more, and accept what I had read in Connected Child, right? Accept what I had learned as I continued to learn about more connected parenting. It made more sense to me, and I began to see the results of it happening in my home. So that was a huge part of just kind of recognizing, oh, it's kind of, I always say it's kind of like we turn parenting on its head a bit, in that many of us parents focus on our child being trustworthy. So, like, okay, if I can trust you, then you can go to your friend's house and I can trust that you're going to make the right decisions. Or if I can trust you, then you can get a driver's license. If I can trust you, then you can have these privileges. That
Right.
is the reciprocal relationship that we often think of in parenting. But when we're talking about parenting children who've come from the foster care system or adoption or whatever, where their beginnings were not trustworthy for them, then it becomes my job to earn their trust in me. And I wasn't doing that intentionally. It's not like, I mean, I thought that I was doing that by being a trustworthy parent, right? I was providing their needs. I was holding them, rocking them at bedtime. I was reading them stories. We were feeding them. We were spending time. We're doing all of those things, but I didn't recognize that I needed to be more intentional in building that trust in me, that they did not have that felt safety.
Yeah.
Even though they were safe, they did not feel that in their bodies. And so that was a big shift for me, being able to understand it's now my job to earn their trust. And in that, we've seen huge improvements and change and connection.
Yeah. I think what you said about the book Connected Parenting, it sounds permissive when you first read it. And that was something I felt too. I was like, this is so permissive. We're just saying yes to everything and we're just letting them run the show. But in all reality, when it's practiced appropriately, and this took a long time for me to learn, but when it's practiced appropriately, it actually is more rigid than even maybe traditional parenting. It's just in the approach is completely opposite.
Yeah.
And it's not permissive at all, really. It's just creating that environment that allows them to feel safe, whether we think it doesn't matter if we think it's silly or not. It's about them and their nervous system and them feeling safe. And I
Right.
think that is so much of parenting is like traditional parenting is they need to conform.
Yep.
And parenting kids with trauma is we have to conform.
Absolutely.
And it's humbling,
Yep.
it's overwhelming. You have to I mean, yeah, friends look at me like I am absolutely crazy and losing my mind. And a lot of times they get, well, that's a typical 5-year-old, or oh,
Yes.
typical teenager. I'm like, no, you have no clue. This isn't, I'm telling you 10% of the story. This is not typical teenager at all. And when we actually get into it, and it is isolating, it does feel isolating, and I think that's why that support is so important. Being able to walk into a room and having those heads nod and that validation of I'm not crazy, I don't have this horrific outrageous story, this is normal in this world, but my world isn't traditional world. And it does feel isolating if you don't have that community and those connections. So, how did you end up then taking it a step further and becoming a TBRI practitioner? You started to see those results in your home. So, then how did you move forward from there?
Sure. So I want to back up and tell a little story first, and
Sure.
then I'll move into kind of how this became part of my profession, which was never, never expected at all. But you're so right in that we end up having to conform and change and be willing to do that. And it becomes so worth it because we start to recognize that it really is what our children, it's about meeting their needs. And
Yeah,
that's what we all want to do as parents. I mean, even if we're coming in with tools that don't work, ultimately we all are wanting to meet our kids' needs.
absolutely.
It's just not intuitive of what the needs are for kids who maybe you did not raise from birth. And so being willing to be open-minded about taking on new strategies and being willing to read and learn and research becomes a big part of how to adjust for what your kids need. And so one of the tools that is pretty common in traditional parenting is punishment.
Mhm.
And so that, was definitely there in what we thought of as parenting, my husband and I. And but as we became more and more familiar with parenting with like a trust focus, then really punishment doesn't have much of a place there. Correction does, and guidance does, and boundaries definitely do. They're really, really important. Structure is really important in parenting
Yeah.
with a trust based approach. but not necessarily punishment. And so we had this issue with, so one of my kiddos, we used to like to buy bags of chocolate chips for things like to put in our yogurt or to put, to have as a treat. And so I would buy a bag of chocolate chips. I'd stash it in my pantry over with all of my baking things. And so that I could pull it out when we wanted to make protein balls or whatever we wanted to do. And I went into my pantry and we hadn't had this bag of chocolate chips for very long, but it was completely empty. And so this was not necessarily a new type of behavior in our house. And so I was frustrated that this had happened. And so I talked to the child who I was pretty sure was the one who emptied the chocolate chips over time and said, okay, I'm going to replenish these chocolate chips. We're going to buy another bag of chocolate chips. You're going to go to the store with me. I'm going to let you pick out the bag that you want to pick out, but you have to, you can't touch these without permission. Like these are off limits except for when we're using them for these things. So I did that. We bought a new bag of chocolate chips and I was like, okay, these are off limits. You can't touch this. You've got to have permission. I explained all the things. So I thought we were set, right? A couple of days later, completely empty bag of chocolate chips. And so at this
I feel
point,
like you're telling stories from my home too. I could tell the same story.
and I had already offered the grace, right? Like
Yes.
I didn't give the punishment to begin with. We were going to try again. That's huge in TBRI, which is what I was learning about TBRI at the time. We're going to try again. And so we tried again and it didn't work. And so at that point, it was really tempting to regress into back to the strategies that I normally go into. And I did to some degree because I became very dysregulated. I became very upset. I'm sure I gave lots of great lectures and raised my voice in that situation. And so my husband and I were talking about it. We literally had pantry locks in our Amazon cart. And he was like, you just tell me when and we will buy them. Right. And so I was like, okay, that's what I feel like doing. Mm-hmm. But it's not what I know is the best thing to do. So let's hold on and let's just try. Let's try this approach again. And so instead of a punishment, instead of a lock on the door, I brought my child back in and said, okay, we're going to try this again. And so I bought a clear jar and chocolate chips, and I filled up the jar with chocolate chips this time. And I said, okay, we're going to leave it here on the counter. You can have these chocolate chips, but here's the caveat. Put a little sign on it and said, okay, you can have 10 chocolate chips a day, but you have to ask permission first. Because one of the things that TBRI encourages us to do is to build that trust, right? If that child asks permission and I can say yes, that goes into his little yes bank, and he's going to go, oh, that person, mom, she lives up to her word. She does what she says she's going to do. She says yes to me when she says she's going to say yes to me. And so we set that up and set the jar up and we talked about it. And of course, what happens is they immediately ask for their 10 chocolate chips for the day. And they asked, I give permission. We say, yes, I'm feeling great about myself. I've done it. I've done the TBRI. I'm a great mom. I know exactly what I'm doing. A couple of days later, that jar is emptied out again. Chocolate chips.
Yep.
And so it really is kind of this long game because we have this, like these moments where we're like, we feel like there's forward progress and we feel like, man, I'm done the things as the mom to earn the trust. Why is it not working? But each step does make a difference. So we did it again. We tried again. And fourth time was a charm, in that we were able to begin to develop this system of asking for what we wanted, asking for what we needed. And I was able to say, yes, yes, yes. And so learning that piece of being able to look for opportunities to say yes, looking for opportunities to earn their trust in me by not just going to punishment first makes a difference. It doesn't mean that there's never consequences that come from behavior. It doesn't mean that there aren't boundaries that are set up to make sure that they're safe. Right. But it means that if I haven't earned trust in my child doesn't trust me, it doesn't matter what consequences I give. Right. They're never going to be effective because it's that trust relationship that makes them understand the consequences to begin with. So yeah, that parenting felt really weird. It still feels really, really weird. And it, like you said, can be very isolating. And so I had connected with a woman in our state who was doing trust-based relational intervention trainings. And I wanted my husband and I to do that. And I began to look into it right before COVID hit, and they all went virtual after that. And I didn't want virtual. I kept kind of waiting for an in-person one to come in the meantime, I had stayed connected through social media with Amy Cooper, who was doing these trainings, and she sent me a message in the summer of 2021 and said, I'm doing this thing and I'm hiring. I have some positions to hire. Would you be interested in a job? And I wasn't looking for a job at all. I was doing something from home at that point to help my families financially. But the job was to come in and be a resource for adoptive parents. So really stressed out, overwhelmed parents who needed resources, who needed to know, who was a good therapist in the area, introduce them to TBRI along the way, those kinds of things. The role was to do that for families all across the state. And so it was one of those opportunities where you're like, this is exactly what I needed 6 years ago. This is the type of person I
Yeah.
wish I had had in my life to walk through this journey with me. Could have given me the head nods from the beginning and could have saved my family years of chaos if I had had someone who was kind of partnering up, holding hands with me along the way. And so even though I wasn't looking for a job, there was absolutely no way I'd say no to this. And so I knew the path had been made straight by God right into this job. And so I started first doing virtual support for families, and then became a TBRI practitioner, which means I was trained by Texas Christian University, where TBRI was originated, and kind of was able to go really deep and in depth in understanding not just trauma, but attachment and the impact of disrupted attachment on our children, the impact of sensory processing issues, just layers and layers of what's going on with our kids so that I could be a support to families. And so I became a family coach, and then eventually have been able to have the amazing experience to be able to be a leader with Flourishing Families as the program director. And so we are able to coach families, dozens and dozens and dozens of families every single year. And all of our staff who work with families are also foster and adoptive parents. And so we're really in the trenches with the families that we're serving. And so it has been incredibly humbling experience to have that full circle moment of really remembering what it was like to cry myself to sleep, feeling all alone in what was going on, and feeling like there was no hope in fixing me as a parent. Like I had become this mom that I had never been before, who I never wanted to be, and I didn't know how to get out of that.
Yeah.
And TBRI started to give me the hope and the skills that were necessary to kind of start climbing my way out of that, and to be able to sit in meetings with other moms and dads who are feeling desperate and give them a little glimmer of hope. And if nothing else, be able to say, I don't have all the answers, but you won't do this alone anymore, is just super humbling. So that's how I got just this very unexpected path that God created very clearly. And when Amy contacted me, I knew there was no way I could say no.
That's incredible. And I know you have impacted so many families, and even just our families in Thrive, the workshops that you've done, the feedback we get from your work is incredible.
Well, thank
And I'm a big fan myself, just because there have been so many things that you have explained that I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And putting it into, like I think I said earlier, concepts I knew, but giving me a new understanding and how to apply it. And so I just really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And I'm so grateful you were here today to share your story and some of that background. Maybe we'll have you on again, and you can, maybe I can just pick your brain about some
you.
real life things going on here. Um, and we can be like, all right, here's a problem. How do I overcome? But I just really appreciate you joining me today and sharing your story.
Thanks so much for having me, Anna. Loved it.
Absolutely.